The following recording is a production of Kicking Out at 2 in conjunction with the Retromania Pro Wrestling Podcast Network and is intended for private use only. For more information, head on over to facebook.com/Kicking Out at 2 or our Twitter handle @Kicking Out 2, along with searching Retromania with a W on any and all podcast platforms available to listen to archive shows such as this and all the great content of the Retromania Pro Wrestling Podcast Network. Evergreen content at your fingertips anytime at your listening pleasure. And with that being said, we thank you for listening and hope you enjoy the show.
We are back here this Labor Day weekend for Diary of a Hulkamaniac Part 2. I'm your host, Dave Rosenblue. Thank you all for pressing play, hitting download, liking, subscribing, rating, reviewing this podcast here on the Retromania Pro Wrestling Podcast Network. And it's been a little bit. Summer has been just rolling along. I've been busy with my shoot job, enjoying the summer, enjoying the weather as well. And I apologize if your listening needs have not been met, but I'm closing out the summer here with a very sentimental episode of Kicking Out at 2, as I'm going to be sharing my thoughts on the back nine of Hulk Hogan's career, Diary of a Hulkamaniac Part 2. You can find Diary of a Hulkamaniac Part 1 in the archives by going over to Retromania with a W or search Kicking Out at 2 on any podcast platform available, and you will find that episode as I talked about the glory years, the golden age with the WWF from 84 or 86, I should say, when I started watching, to 1993. So I thought I would discuss on the back end here his WCW run, some highs and lows from that, as well as his time in TNA, his return to WWE before that in 2002, some of the more controversial stuff post-wrestling career for Hulk Hogan, his hosting gig at WrestleMania 30, his NWO Hall of Fame induction, as well as what was arguably one of the greatest moments of my fandom. Just a few weeks ago at the Fanatics Fest, I got to meet Hulk Hogan, and I'll talk about that. I'll end that. I'll end this episode with that. We're going to build up to it and get to the main event. Might not be a long main event, but we will get to the main event. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it. I hope you guys have had a great summer. Head over to Retromania over on Podbean, and you can find this show as well as all kinds of other archived content from Kobe Nida with Marking Out the Days, Cool Truth with AC, Hulkamania is Dead, which is it was a vanity project of Kobe's and a friend of his. I forget the guy, Jimmy Price, I should say. Sorry about that. They booked the WWF. Had the Iron Sheik really broken Hulk Hogan's leg in real life, and Hulk Hogan was unable to wrestle ever again. So I took part in some episodes of that. That was a lot of fun, but you can go over there and find that out. I don't think that journey's over yet. I think that's been that project has been put on pause or hiatus. I think Kobe's going to get back to that at some point, hopefully. But yeah, check out all the great content over there at Retromania on Podbean by searching Retromania with a W. I've looked in the last few weeks or so, and you guys have been really digging up the archives, and I love it. So thank you all for checking that out as well. Yeah, let's get this thing started here. Let's talk about Hulk Hogan's his time in WCW. Leaves the Actually, before I do that, this came across my feed on social media just more recently. There's a meme that is out there, and it's been out there for quite some time, but it just so happened it came across my feed. It says, when your friends always turn on you, maybe you're the problem. And there's pictures of Hogan with the individuals that they had claimed turned on him on television, his Hulk Hogan character. Of course, Randy Savage, Macho Man, Mega Powers, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, Andre the Giant, and the recently departed Sid Vicious, Psycho Sid, fortunately passing away. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But and then the one that strikes me here on this meme is a picture of Hulk Hogan with Tugboat. Now, I don't ever recall Tugboat turning on Hulk Hogan on television. Now, excuse me, in more recent years, listening to other wrestling podcasts, there was an idea, and it was a pretty god-awful idea, but there was an idea that Bruce Pritchard had shared on an episode of Something to Wrestle that would have potentially turned one of my favorite WrestleManias into one of the worst WrestleManias of all time. That's just my opinion. But they wanted to turn Tugboat heel and rename him Sheik Tugboat, and he was going to be like the Iraqi sympathizer. Now, I don't know. I mean, I'm under the impression that idea was something that spawned off of the possibility that they couldn't agree to bring Sergeant Slaughter back. And Sergeant Slaughter obviously, had the run that he did at that time against Hogan at WrestleMania 7. But I was under the impression that was a backup plan. That's just how it comes across to me. But had they run with that idea, Tugboat, turning him into Sheik Tugboat, and he was the Iraqi sympathizer during the Gulf War at that time in 91. It definitely wouldn't have sold out the Los Angeles Memorial Coliseum, the stadium that seats 100,000 people, which is the original location for WrestleMania 7. Unfortunately, they couldn't sell enough tickets. They only sold about 17,000, and that was enough to fill up the indoor arena, the sports complex in L.A., so they had to move it. They claim security reasons, but I'm going to call bullshit on that. Anyhow, I don't think that would have filled up the stadium, that's for sure. But I don't ever remember Tugboat turning on Hulk Hogan. I do remember Tugboat turning on the Bushwhackers in a 6-man tag on Superstars against the Nasty Boys and Earthquake, and then thus forming the Natural Disasters with Earthquake. But I don't ever remember Tugboat turning on Hulk Hogan. Now, I'm a big Hogan sympathizer, okay? And in more recent years, as I've gotten older, the way that the Hogan Randy Savage story has been depicted was that Savage had turned on Hogan, but you could see the little subtle nuances with Hogan's behavior around Elizabeth that I can understand why Randy Savage's character would have thought that Hogan was trying to move in on his old lady. The Orndorff thing, he was Hogan's enemy before he was his friend, and then the common denominator between Orndorff and then eventually Andre the Giant was Bobby the Brain Heenan. So I think this meme is just for those Hogan haters out there that have issues with Terry Bollea, the real-life person, and that's fine. You can hate on him all you want, but sometimes it's just weird, the fandom that some fans have to go to such great lengths to try to prove a point, and I think that's what this meme was, really. It's silly. It's a wrestling character. But nonetheless, I thought I'd share that with you guys to open up this episode here. Now, we left off with Hulk Hogan leaving the WWF in 1993. We take a brief sabbatical and enter the world of television with his Thunder in Paradise television show, which I thought was kind of cool at that age, But looking back on it, it wasn't quality television programming. Go check it out. It's on YouTube. I think you can find episodes on YouTube. It's pretty grainy, but you can check it out. Excuse me. So, summer '94, Hulk Hogan debuts for WCW. And who do they put him up against? Well, the guy that they should have put him up against at WrestleMania 8, and that's Ric Flair. And I remember in '94, it felt... I watched both programs as much as I could, but WCW had more of my attention because I was a Hulk Hogan guy, because I was upset at the way Hulk Hogan had left the WWF. So I was happy that he was going to get a second chance. And plus, you were going to see a lot of newer matchups. And even at 11 years old, I thought that was cool, that he was going to face newer guys. He was going to have that big moment with Ric Flair, because I'll go on record as to say, and I might have said it on the last, my Diary of a Hulkamaniac Part 1, but I really have a hard time believing that Hulk Hogan and Ric Flair did not draw very well on the house show circuit, and that was the reason why they didn't go with Hogan and Flair at WrestleMania 8. And Hogan and Flair wrestled the house show loops in the fall of 91, so like late September, early October, maybe even parts of November. Big markets, New York, Boston, Chicago, all big wrestling markets. And all big markets that were familiar with Ric Flair. And that was another excuse, too, that I had heard guys like Bruce Pritchard and other individuals claim that, well, Flair was, an NWA, WCW guy. Some people in this area weren't really familiar with him. I call bullshit on that. 100%. I can't give you the reason why, in my opinion, why they didn't go with it at WrestleMania 8. The only one that I can rationalize, and I might have said this before, is maybe Hulk Hogan's exit from the WWF in 1992 had something to do with it. After WrestleMania 8, I think they looked at it like, well, Flair has the title. He just came in. If we put the title on Hulk and then we have to pivot because Hulk has to leave, we need a champion. And so I think that's why they made the switch. I think there is some politics behind it, too, as well. I've heard all different kinds of theories. Hogan left because the feds were on Vince's ass with the steroid trial coming up. Hulk and Vince had a falling out. Hulk and Flair couldn't agree to a finish. I've heard all kinds of different theories over the years, but I'm guessing that it was a combination of Hulk and Vince agreed that he was going to leave for a little while because the feds were on Vince's ass with the steroid trial. Hulk was going to take a break, and the timing just wasn't right for Hogan and Flair at that time. But nonetheless, they made up for it in WCW. I didn't watch the pay-per-view as a kid, but I've seen the match. I just watched it recently. That go out of your way to watch Bash at the Beach 94 if you have an opportunity to. It's a really fun show overall, but the energy level for Hogan debuting in WCW in Orlando in that arena against Flair, it was unlike anything I've ever seen for a WCW show at that time. Because it was, I wouldn't say it was a failing product, but they had some struggles in the early 90s when Ted Turner and Time Warner purchased the company. But, I thought it was the right way to get Hogan involved, put him with Flair. Now, Flair has said over the years in shoot interviews that, maybe Hogan shouldn't have come in and won the title so soon. I wouldn't have been against that idea had Hogan maybe chased Flair for the title. Now, the way that their angle was set up, Hogan beats Flair. Then they have a rematch at Clash of Champions. Flair wins by a countout because they did the Tanya Harding angle, which was actually pretty clever, I'll say. And then the rubber match was a career-ending match inside of a cage at Halloween Havoc, and Flair lost that. I can understand Flair's frustrations. I don't think anybody would have really cared to see Hogan and Flair for a third time, especially when Hogan was still the champion. I would not have been against, let's say, if Hogan and Flair had their match at Bash at the Beach and there was some sort of schmoz finish. Flair barely escaped with the title, and then it sets up a rematch. And then maybe, at Clash of the Champions, and they do the Tanya Harding angle there, and Flair, wins by countout, sneaks out with a victory, but then finally Hogan and Flair settle their differences in a cage, Halloween Havoc, career match, and Hogan comes out on top. I don't disagree with Flair's logic in that, and I've heard him talk about that on numerous interviews. Only for Flair to come back a few months later. But yeah, great way for Hogan to come into WCW against Flair, and it was the match everyone wanted to see. It was the Aftermag Dream match, and I was glad that they started that right off the rip. Later on that year, we would eventually see more and more WWF cast-offs join WCW. Hacksaw Jim Duggan, Earthquake, who eventually became Avalanche, who debuted following the Hogan-Flair cage match at Halloween Havoc and formed some trio with Kevin Sullivan, the late Kevin Sullivan, who just passed away recently, and Brutus the fucking Barber Beefcake, as Conrad Thompson would say. Yeah, we were going, looking back on it, I didn't know what to make of it back then. I was just happy to see Hogan on my TV, but it felt like a rehash of like WWF. And I wasn't overly excited for it, but I didn't hate it either. Because again, Hogan was my guy, so I was happy to see Hogan on WWF programming. But this is where the content in WCW was starting to go towards that cartoonish point in time. Hogan would reunite with Savage. Savage would come over from the WWF, and we would get like a Mega Powers reunion. They teased Savage maybe turning on Hogan at that Starrcade, so that was interesting. And then they were off to the races, Vader and Hogan for Super Brawl in February, which I remember going to my friend Dean's house to watch that pay-per-view to see Hogan and Vader, because that, to me, in my opinion, was a big dream match. That was the first time, at least, seeing Hogan in WCW, with the exception of Flair, where Hogan wrestled someone that he had never wrestled before. So I was intrigued by that. And Vader was a big monster. Vader had a huge run in WCW prior to Hogan entering, with his matches with Sting, Cactus Jack, the career match with Ric Flair at Starrcade the year prior, a couple years prior. Vader and Hogan, to me, was a big-time match. And it's one of my hidden gems of Hogan matches against Vader at Super Brawl 5 in 1995. That card actually is, it's actually a pretty fun show. It's nothing to like write home about, but maybe because I saw it live and I was excited to see Hogan and Vader, that energy just carried throughout the whole show. But Hogan and Vader, Super Brawl 5, go out of your way to watch it. Really fun match. And you get to see a little bit of vulnerability from Hulk Hogan, because he's in there with this monster Vader who he had never faced off with before. So that was that was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. But like I said, the cartoonish, and it started to get down, it started to go down that path. Flair would eventually return at the uncensored pay-per-view, dressed up as a woman, and that set up his return to be reinstated. And they had the tag match with Flair and Vader against Hogan and Savage, I believe at Slamboree. And then the Dungeon of Doom would surface, and yeah, it's bad. It's just bad. Let's just call it what it is. It's bad. I had a hard time rationalizing Dungeon of Doom. I really did. Now, if they took all of those characters at Dungeon of Doom and they didn't create any of them, and let's just say it was Kevin Sullivan as the mouthpiece for the Giant, who would eventually become Big Show in the WWF, and they ran with that, I'd have been cool with that. But the Dungeon of Doom was just too cartoonish, too hokey, so bad it's funny, okay? Now, there are some fans out there that were not in favor of the way that the Giant had debuted in WCW, because they tried to portray him as Andre the Giant's son. I don't fault WCW for doing that. It might not have been a great idea, but look at the man. He's over 7 feet tall, okay? And Hogan and WCW probably saw it as a money-making opportunity. We can kind of recreate the second coming of WrestleMania 3 with Hulk Hogan and this giant of a man who had Andre the Giant-like features. So I don't blame them for going that route. It wouldn't, to me, creatively, it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that this man at this size, at over 7 feet tall, was the son of Andre the Giant, and he was coming back to get revenge on Hulk Hogan. I thought it was not a bad idea at all. The way it was executed, with the whole Dungeon of Doom as the garnish, if you will, on the main course, it didn't sit well, and I get that. I totally understand that. But yeah, I wasn't against the idea of like, oh yeah, this is Andre's son coming back for revenge, because it made sense. It just made sense. It did, and you may look at me, or you may think that I'm crazy, but in all honesty, just connect the dots a little bit, and you might understand why I feel the way I do about that. Now, also later in that year, we would get the launch of Nitro. Hogan was a part of that in the Mall of America, main event against Big Bubba, and then eventually Lex Luger would debut. We all know about how Luger did that. You can watch all kinds of documentaries on Peacock, about Luger and Monday Night Wars and Nitro and all of this stuff. But what I took away from that time period with Hogan and WCW, at least like, the night, around the launch of Nitro, was the testing of the heel run. At least that's how I look at it now. when Kevin Sullivan shaved his mustache on that episode of Nitro and Hulk Hogan wore all black and he was dark and the Dungeon of Doom had forced him to go over to the dark side. And it was becoming a conflict of interest with his on-screen friendships with Randy Savage and Sting, who were fighting the Dungeon of Doom. But also, it was a conflict with Sting even more because Sting's best friend Lex Luger was in the picture, and he was kind of fighting off the Dungeon of Doom, but Hogan and Savage couldn't trust him. But Sting was vouching for him the whole time. So I thought that I didn't like it at that time, but when I look back on it, it was a preview of what was to come with the NWO. Now, I'll get into that in a little bit, but I remember as a kid, there was an episode of Nitro, an early episode in the fall of 95, where Hogan dressed in all black, wrestled Sting, and they hyped it as this like huge dream match. And I'll never forget. That's another dream match. That was the match that I wanted to see most when Hogan came to WCW, because that was another one of those aftermath dream matches where Sting was from Venice Beach, California, and so was Hogan. And Hogan was, this hero in the WWF, and Sting was the top babyface in WCW, and he was adored by fans. And to see these two superpowers collide, if you will, these two larger-than-life characters. At 11 years old, 12 years old, I should say, at that time. It was something that I was intrigued by. I was more intrigued by the matchups that Hogan was going to have against guys that he had never worked with before at 12 years old. I wanted to see him with Vader. Rick Rude was another one. Unfortunately, his injury forced him to retire, but a Hulk Hogan-Rick Rude program in WCW would have been very, very, very intriguing. Although I've heard stories that Hogan didn't want to work with Rick Rude because Rick Rude was too rough in the ring, and he was a little bit of a hothead. But that's Hogan's opinion. But me personally, Rick Rude, who was a ultimate heel against the ultimate babyface Hulk Hogan, that would have been something to see. But back to Sting and Hogan. That episode of Nitro. Ended in the schmaz, Dungeon of Doom run in, and Hogan and Sting are still kind of friends again. But that was like a little teaser. I was like, damn, they gave us that. And, now I wanted to see it on pay-per-view. And that was, I think, the object that, they gave you a little bit on free TV to get people to watch, and then we'll save it for a later date. But yeah, that was my main reasons why I liked Hogan in WCW was because of the possibilities of these certain matchups that he was going to encounter. But as we saw, time went on, and Hogan's run was getting stale. The audience was not into it. I think the last straw was that cage match, that Doomsday cage match with Hogan and Savage against everybody in that like 3-story cage with all the different rooms. Yeah, go in the archives. Dennis and I watched that match on a couple of years ago during COVID. We called it the COVID-19 of pro wrestling gimmick matches because that was pretty bad. And we didn't see Hogan for quite a while until Bash at the Beach, where he turned heel. Now, I've talked about this 100 times. You can go in the archives, check it out on many episodes, but Hogan turning heel was a shot in the arm for his character, for WCW programming with the NWO. It was where I was becoming a little more sophisticated and mature as a fan, not really buying into a lot of the cartoonish aspects of wrestling, and I was adopting more of a reality-based train of thought when it came to storytelling and wrestling and the NWO. And I mean, we can go on for days talking, a whole episode about the impact of the NWO, but it was, I don't think it gets enough credit for what it did for the wrestling business. And essentially, I truly feel like that was one of the major, what's the right word? It was like it was it was what was poking WWF to go in a little more edgier direction. Okay? They looked at it like, oh, wow, like, you know, they took our guys, Hall, Nash, and Hogan, and they made them cool again. And so WWF needed to find something that was going to make them cool again and run with the times. And the NWO, I think, with their reality-based storytelling, especially, you know, coinciding with the launch of Nitro a year prior, just really helped blow up the wrestling business even further. And for a while, early on in the Hogan heel run, there was early parts of it where I was like, I don't know if like it worked. It was cool, but at the same time, I was like, when are they going to turn him back as a good guy? And I was waiting at certain moments. One of them being when Roddy Piper came to WCW, and Piper had pretty much kind of reignited his WWF feud with Hogan in WCW. And I thought maybe Piper was going to be the one to kind of like turn him back and make him into the hero, but they didn't. And I'm cool with that because obviously we saw how great that worked out for Hogan in his time in WCW. He was a very dominant champion with the NWO. The match with Piper at Starrcade 96, I think it wasn't a great match, but the spectacle leading up to it and the crowd for that show really made it a big deal. The Hogan-Piper matches later on in WCW were snooze fests, and I could care less. But the Starrcade 96 match, I was a lot of fun. You could feel that energy from that crowd, that they were ready to see somebody get Hogan and put him in his place, because Hogan's heel run and formation of the NWO a few months prior really turned WCW on its ear and really shake things up. And, you know, Hogan became the hottest heel in all of wrestling at that time. Him and even Steve Austin were rivaling neck and neck as far as who was the hotter heel. And I'll go as to say, you know, yeah, Austin used cuss words and he really amped up the volume for his character, but Hogan really reinvented himself and put like another 10 years of shelf life for him in the wrestling business. So yeah, the Piper match at Starrcade, definitely, I would go out of your way to check that match out as well. It's nothing great technical wrestling masterpiece like, but it's still a fun match to watch. Obviously, his match with Luger, when Luger beat him for the title on the 100th episode of Nitro, that's a lot of fun. I get why they did that, but then Hogan eventually won the belt back a week later at the pay-per-view. The Rodman tag matches, when he tagged with Rodman against Luger and the Giant at Bash at the Beach 97, and then, of course, the match against Karl Malone and Diamond Dallas Page, which you can find both of those matches in our archives. Dennis and I watched both of those matches a couple of years ago. The Rodman-Malone tag match was last year, but find those in the archives. That was a lot of fun to check out and watch. And then, of course, the match with Sting at Starrcade 97. We've heard the stories. Whether, you know, Sting wasn't physically ready and Hogan wasn't going to do business because of that. And I'm not going to get into all of that because, you know, everybody's got different opinions about it. Hogan, Bischoff, Sting, whatever. They couldn't agree to something. Something changed. Some politics took place, which I'm sure it all did. Whether Hogan told referee Nick Patrick to sabotage the fast 3 count to then set up Bret Hart's entry into the match as the special referee. I'm not going to sit here and speculate and give you my thoughts whether that happened or didn't happen. But what I'm more surprised about, and what eventually led to them dropping the ball again, was Hogan Sting was built up for so long, for 18 months. Hogan in the NWO were the reason why Sting went over to the dark side, adopted this brooding crow-like character, didn't speak for months, but would make random appearances on Nitro to save WCW from the NWO. And You would think that that match with Hogan and Sting would have either had a special guest referee because the stakes were so high, or they would have put it in a cage so that there was no interference. And I was kind of surprised that they didn't attach a gimmick to that match. Also, for the fact that Sting had been out of the ring for so long that he didn't wrestle a match, that maybe some type of gimmick match would have camouflaged a little bit of the ring rust, whether it was a street fight or a no disqualification or, like I said, a cage match, what have you. I was kind of surprised they didn't go in that direction for the Starrcade match. But then they had the opportunity to do that again because of the controversial fast count, or whatever you want to call it, at Super Brawl in 98. And once again, they didn't do that. And yet there was still run-ins and schmazes in that match as well. And that's where I wouldn't say I was turned off by WCW and Hogan, but I needed a little bit of a break. And coincide that with Mike Tyson's involvement in that year's WrestleMania. WWF was a hotter product. I kind of focused a little more of my attention onto that. But I will say that what stemmed from that was the split of the NWO. Hogan leading one side, Kevin Nash leading the other side. I was intrigued by the story of that split because it made sense that, like, the Empire was going to crumble and there was infighting within the NWO. I didn't see a split necessarily. I envisioned it that Hogan was going to get drummed out because he lost the belt, and that, like, Nash was going to lead the entire NWO, and Hogan was going to go back to being a babyface. But they didn't do that, and I was fine with that. But I thought that the story of the split, people look at that split of the NWO and they're like, that's terrible. It was just to sell more T-shirts, and maybe it was to sell more T-shirts, but it worked. That Wolf Pack was red hot, and when they would, clash with the Black and White on Nitros and Thunders, and Hogan being, a big part of that, that made me want to see Nash and Hogan. Because the tension between them on screen in their promos, it looked very real. And I remember at that time reading stuff on the internet, whether it was true or not, that they had beef with each other. And they have admitted that at times they had some political issues within the creative process of WCW with their storylines against each other. So the big dream match with Nash, I was kind of hoping we would get that at like a Starrcade. And we didn't get to see that. Hogan wasn't even a part of that Starrcade. Obviously, Nash beat Goldberg, and then that led to the finger poke. And I wasn't against the finger poke and reuniting the NWO and that, like, Wolfpack Elite with Nash, Hall, Bagwell, Steiner, Luger, and Hogan. And Bischoff was like the mouthpiece. But what I didn't like about it was the fact that there was no follow-up to it. Goldberg should have ran through that entire NWO, and there was a lot of things that prevented that. Like, that should have been the catalyst for Goldberg basically being the one to save WCW and disband the NWO for good. And then maybe that would eventually turn Hogan back into a good guy. And I've talked about it before on this podcast. The finger poke in theory was not a bad idea, in my opinion. I just think the follow-up was terrible. Had Goldberg run through the NWO, he would have had 6 months, maybe even a year of just going through that NWO, picking them apart. Even the B-team guys like Scott Norton and Horace Hogan and Vincent and Stevie Ray, if he ran through all those guys and then had like marquee matches on pay-per-view with like Nash and Steiner and Hall, and then eventually it leads to Hogan, let's say at like Bash at the Beach or Halloween Havoc or something, or even go far as Starrcade 99, I think that the finger poke would have been better received. And I also think too, because it took place on the same night as the Mankind Mick Foley world title win over on Raw, that it leaves a bad taste in people's mouth. But nonetheless, I didn't think it was a terrible idea in theory. And like I said, some things attributed to that. Scott Hall, I think, was injured. Luger had an injury. Goldberg eventually hurt his knee. People think that Goldberg tore his bicep in that limousine when he smashed the window. That was a year later. Then eventually Hogan got hurt, and there was no real end to that NWO storyline, which I thought was disappointing, very much so. They created something that was so hot, and they ran for it for so long. And yeah, the well got pretty dry towards the end, but I thought that they were going to put a period on the end of that long, drawn-out, complete sentence known as the end. Excuse me, as the NWO. And they did not do that, which then eventually led to the summer of '99, where Hogan would return, but to the red and yellow. I've said it, and I'll say it again. That was them throwing mud at the wall and seeing if it was going to stick. That's what that was at the end of the day. WWF was so hot at that time that I had a hard time watching WCW programming. It was just stale and boring, and even Hogan as the babyface champion, as much as I loved Hulk Hogan, it just didn't work. It didn't work. It was the old-timers club. You know, you had Hogan, you had Sting, you had Nash, you had Flair, Diamond Dallas Page. Bret Hart would make his return after being on a sabbatical for a little bit. And then that eventually would lead to the introduction of Vince Russo behind the scenes as the head writer for WCW, where he kind of shook the programming up in the fall of '99. That led to Hogan's removal from television, which was a weird, a weird concept of Hogan laying down for Sting at Halloween Havoc and leaving. They were trying to implement some form of reality from what was being speculated on the internet that was taking place behind the scenes between Hogan and Russo. As a teenager, I thought, okay, this is interesting. Like, let's see where this goes. And then Hogan disappeared for a while. And then during Hogan's absence, Russo got drummed out. And then Hogan came back, and it was back to, you know, Hulk Hogan, red and yellow again. In the January, February of 2000 against Ric Flair. They went to that well again. And I wasn't even watching the programming then. But I eventually gave it another shot when they brought Russo back, and they had him with Bischoff, who was ousted months prior. And they introduced the Millionaires Club versus the New Blood. Now, the idea in theory, because of everything that had been speculated online regarding the state of the locker room in WCW, I thought was a good way to wipe the slate clean and start over. I tried my hardest to give it a try, and looking back on it now, I was a fool for watching some of those Nitros because of the programming, the things that they would put on there. There are some very few bright spots, and I consider Hulk Hogan's time during that Millionaires Club New Blood angle to be a bright spot. Not the feud with Billy Kidman, because when you look at that on paper, you look at 25-pound soaking wet Billy Kidman at that time versus 265-pound Hulk Hogan. It just didn't make sense. But what I did like about it was we saw more of a angrier Terry Bollea when, Hogan wouldn't wear the red and yellow. He basically wore street clothes. He had black jeans and a t-shirt, and he came across to me like an angry father that was, wanting to kill, the boyfriend of the daughter. That's the perception I got from him. And so I thought that was kind of neat that they deviated from the usual Hulk Hogan or Hollywood Hogan, and they kind of brought Terry Bollea to life in this character. That was really the only bright spot of Hogan's involvement. Even the Bash at the Beach stuff with Jeff Jarrett and then Booker T and Vince Russo, I thought the real life aspect of it could work, but it wasn't going to resurrect WCW at that point. They were on death's door, and it was time for them to close up shop. And eventually, the WWF would purchase them, and that was that. But that Bash at the Beach angle with Jarrett and Russo and them, I thought it had potential to be something, but it wasn't going to change wrestling and change WCW's perception. People had already kind of soured on WCW at that point. Excuse me, let me take a sip of my coffee here. And then we saw, just a couple of years later, Hulk Hogan's return to the WWF, and then eventually became WWE. And that was a lot of fun. I loved the idea. I couldn't wait for the NWO to be a part of the WWF. I thought, oh man, the New World Order, the poison of the WWF with Hogan, Hall, and Nash, and who are they going to recruit in their group? And they didn't really recruit anybody. They eventually had X-Pac, but that was after they had turned Hogan back into a babyface, which was the smarter move because people wanted to see it. But the one disappointing thing about that run was that we didn't get Hogan and Austin. That was the match that I wanted to see. Hogan and Rock's great, and I love Hogan and Rock from WrestleMania. But I wouldn't have been against the idea of the NWO in a tag match at that WrestleMania against like Stone Cold and The Rock, and then maybe like a third guy like Undertaker or Triple H or somebody like that, having like a 6-man tag dream match. But we still got greatness with Hogan and Rock. It's considered one of the greatest matches of all time. It's considered one of the greatest WrestleMania matches of all time. Definitely one of Hulk Hogan's greatest matches at that stage in the game. I mean, he was, I don't know how old he was. I mean, he's 71 now, so you look that he was in his 50s at that point, and he was still entertaining and hulking up, brother. And so, looking back, that was obviously the better route. But I was kind of hoping Hogan and Austin would clash at some point. They did have that interaction, that handicap match on the Go Home episode of Raw right before WrestleMania when Austin tagged with Rock, and I thought that was going to lead to Hogan and Austin more, but Hogan's popularity was growing so much that they couldn't help it. They had to turn him into a good guy, and I don't blame them for that. Go where the money is, and the money was in Hulk Hogan merchandise, this nostalgia run again. Winning the championship, that was fun, but I knew at that time it was going to be short-lived because the WWF was going through the brand extension, and they were changing the guard from the Attitude Era, even though it had a little bit of attitude to their programming. So seeing Hogan beat Triple H for the championship and then lose it to Undertaker, I was cool with that. I didn't, all right, he got the belt, got the picture-esque moment, and that's that. What my favorite part of that whole run in 2002 was when I got to see Hogan wrestle twice in the week. Raw came to Hartford, Connecticut, and it was actually the first episode of Raw where they referred to him as WWE because they lost the lawsuit and they had to change the logo and all that stuff with the Get the F Out t-shirts. And that was the episode where Hulk Hogan stole Undertaker's motorcycle and the motorcycle stalled out. That was a little funny. But I was able to get tickets to go to the episode of SmackDown they taped the next night in Bridgeport at the Harbor Yard Arena, which is now the Total Mortgage Arena. And that was probably one of the most fun experiences I've had as a fan. I'd put that in my top 5 as a fan. I've been to some WrestleManias, but in 2002 I was in college. One of the guys I went to class with was a big wrestling fan, and we ended up buying tickets from some lady at a gas station that had tickets. She saw me with my wrestling shirt on. I was going in there to get a pack of cigarettes. I smoked at the time, and she said, are you going to the wrestling in Bridgeport? And I was like, no, we just, we're going to the one in Hartford on Monday. And she goes, well, I got these tickets I got to get rid of if you want them. And so me and my buddy, we bought them, and we drove to Bridgeport and had a blast at that episode of SmackDown. The main event was Hulk Hogan and Edge against Chris Jericho and Kurt Angle. And that was the first time where I felt nostalgic about wrestling and about Hulk Hogan, because I felt like I didn't think at that time I would ever see Hulk Hogan ever again wrestle in person. And I got to see him wrestle as the champion in the main event, and that arena was so loud. And that arena only seats like 7,000 or 8,000 people for wrestling. That arena was so loud that I felt like I was watching Hulk Hogan in his prime. Like everybody was into it. People of all ages. My age group at that time, younger kids, people that were older than me. Everybody was going crazy for Hulk. And that's one of my fondest memories as a Hulkamaniac, because I am, of attending that show in May of 2002 on SmackDown, Bridgeport. A lot of fun. And that eventually spawned off into Hulk and Edge winning the tag team titles, which was kind of neat to see Hogan as a tag team champion, because we had always associated him as the heavyweight champion, whether it was the WWF heavyweight championship or the WCW heavyweight championship. So to see him in a tag role with the championship, that was kind of neat. Even though I knew it was going to be very short-lived, it was still neat. And the story of Edge, growing up being a big Hulk Hogan fan, attending WrestleMania 6 to see Hogan and Warrior, and then tagging with him, like it tugs at your heartstrings a little bit. So that was a lot of fun, even though it was short-lived to see Hogan and Edge. That run would continue later that year when Brock Lesnar basically killed him off television. And at the time, there was a rumor that Hogan and Vince were at odds about his involvement at SummerSlam. And they killed Hogan off. I don't know if that's true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. There's all kinds of crazy politicking Hogan stories when it comes to him and Vince, the love-hate relationship they've had over the years. But Brock beating him in 2002 didn't really have an issue with that. They were serious about making Brock, the next big thing. And what better way than to pretty much knock off the greatest of all time in Hulk Hogan on his way to defeating The Rock for the championship at SummerSlam. But I knew that because Hogan was so popular, just in my heart of hearts, I knew that they were going to bring him back, and they eventually did in 2003 for that run with Vince. And I thought at that time, this is it. He's going to wrestle Vince at WrestleMania, and then this is going to be the end of it, and it would have been the perfect way for him to go out. I truly believe that. I'm not against some of the other stuff he did later with like Shawn Michaels and Randy Orton, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if he walked out and said, you know what, I'm done. Because the stipulations were Hogan had to leave the WWF. His career was over if Vince beat him at WrestleMania. And I thought that was going to be Hogan's swan song. And what better way to do than to end it with Vince? I mean, his run pretty much started with, Vince calling the plays and Hulk Hogan executing them. Vince was the coach and Hogan was the quarterback. And they had that big boom and the national run and eventually going, worldwide. What better way for it to end with Hulk Hogan and Vince McMahon in a match and Hogan beating Vince and just saying, yep, I'm done. I truly thought that was the end. And I would have been perfectly fine with it. Perfectly fine with it. And that match was quite the spectacle. That's one of my favorite matches to watch. It's nothing, special from a wrestling standpoint, but from storytelling with Roddy Piper's surprise involvement. Didn't see that coming. That was pretty cool. To Shane McMahon, the cameo at the end, and Hogan coming back, and then that shot with Vince, with his eyes like peered over the ring apron, and he like rises up with the lead pipe, and his face is bloody. I mean, and that match is just a lot of fun to watch. Definitely during WrestleMania season, I always make that whole WrestleMania 19 is a GOAT WrestleMania. It's in my top 5 of greatest WrestleManias of all time, and that match helps make that WrestleMania a GOAT because it was so fun, a true spectacle in nostalgia for me as a fan. And they eventually, as they say, shit the bed when they turned Hulk Hogan into Mr. America and they tried to do a remake of like the Dusty Rhodes Midnight Rider character. I didn't like it at all. I didn't like when they had him wrestle Piper. I just wasn't a fan of it. Then they had Zach Gowen, the one-legged wrestler, involved, and there was a rumor that year that they were going to do Hogan and Vince at that SummerSlam, and it was going to be Mr. America and Vince, and it was going to be mask versus hair. But Hogan and Vince had a falling out, and that didn't work out. So I was disappointed because I was always a big proponent, and I still am to this day, of guys getting like a proper send-off. And not everybody can get a proper send-off, but I thought Hulk deserved a proper send-off for what he did for the WWF, WWE, and just for the business in general. So I thought, yeah, give him a proper send-off, and even if it's against Vince. And they had a falling out. He stepped away. Didn't come back for a couple of years until they brought him back to the Hall of Fame. And I was like, oh, here we go. This is going to be the end. He'll go in the Hall of Fame, and then maybe he'll have like a match against somebody, and then that'll be the end of it. And they did the matches, the tag matches with Shawn Michaels, and man, Backlash '05, Hogan and Michaels against Muhammad Hassan and Daivari. That Manchester, New Hampshire crowd was unbelievable. Watching it on pay-per-view, like it was so exciting to watch. I was jealous I wasn't there in person because they were just on fire for everything. And that eventually led to the Hogan Michaels SummerSlam match. Now I'll share my thoughts on that as well, because I think I don't agree with the story out there was that it was supposed to be a babyface match. Shawn wanted to see if he can go with the greatest of all time, Hulk Hogan. If he had what it takes, if he can put down Hulkamania. But it was supposed to be in a babyface way, very respectable. And the story is that Hulk went to him and said, well, I'd much rather prefer you as, a heel, because I think it would draw better money or draw more money. And Michaels was like, you don't want that heel. You want me to be 1998 Shawn Michaels? Like, I'm, all right, I'm just letting you know. Like, are you sure you're okay with this? And I guess there were a few, so they had Michaels turn on him, which I wasn't really in favor of, even though the turn came out of nowhere, and it was like a shocking way to end that Raw, July 4th, 2005. I just didn't. I thought it was. I honestly thought it was. I didn't like it. I didn't like it at all. I was all for the babyface thing because I'm a big Shawn Michaels guy. My top three: Hogan, Savage, Michaels. Those are my three. And so seeing that match, I wanted Shawn Michaels as a babyface because I knew that cool 1997, 1998 Shawn Michaels would have eaten Hulk Hogan alive on a promo level. So I wasn't a big fan of the turn, but they went through with it. And the story was that in some of those promos, Michaels, pretty much went over the top and, mocked Hogan's age and his limited wrestling ability. And, every time he went to Hogan, he'd be like, are you cool with this? Everything cool? Yeah, brother, no problem, no problem, no problem. And then the idea was that Michaels was going to beat Hogan because they were going to do a trilogy. They were going to do a series of matches. One was going to be at that SummerSlam. I think they were going to do the following WrestleMania, and then maybe like either SummerSlam the next year or WrestleMania the following year, something like that. I don't remember. But there was supposed to be a trilogy. And Hulk allegedly did not take kindly to the way that Shawn Michaels had carried himself in some of those promos, not saying anything, and he pulled the Hulk Hogan Creative Control card and said that he was going to be winning that match with Michaels at SummerSlam, which led to Michaels overselling like a motherfucker for Hulk Hogan. And it's silly, but it's still a fun match to watch, and the crowd was pretty hot for it. That SummerSlam in general is a good show, but that match with Hogan and Michaels, yes, the overselling is silly, and it may be unprofessional for Michaels to conduct business that way, but that's what made that match memorable. And it was still a good match too. It didn't take it. I don't think it took away from the match, but that's just my opinion. And that at that point, after Hogan wrestled Michaels, I thought, okay, like, what else does he need to do here? Steve Austin's not wrestling anymore. The Rock's in Hollywood. I go, maybe in my mind at that time, I was like, if he walks away, that's okay with me. And they teased the idea of a match with Steve Austin, but apparently Austin didn't want to do business with him because of some prior issues that they had in WCW, or at least Austin had with Hogan. And we never got to see that match. So then they eventually pivoted to Hogan and Randy Orton. And they got his daughter involved, and I was not a fan of the Hogan-Randy Orton angle. I just thought, all right, they're really milking Hogan, and yeah, I get it. They want to put Orton over because he's their future, but I wasn't a fan of it. And at that point, that's where I was like, all right, they've screwed the pooch with Hogan's run here. And I think it's time to step away. And he did, and he eventually did. And there was talk of him coming back at WrestleMania in 2007, maybe doing something with Big Show. They were going to kind of recreate Hogan and Andre in Detroit. But there was some issues there, and I think Hogan was going to eventually. It's ironic now you look back on it, with the way that our world is, especially Hogan's involvement at the Republican National Convention, representing endorsing Donald Trump for president. But Hogan was rumored to be Trump's representative in the hair match with Vince for that WrestleMania, and Hulk and Vince had some issues with his involvement in that show. I think Hulk even spoiled the Hall of Fame class on the Bubba the Love Sponge show, and that's when they were like, yeah, we're not going to do anything with him at this WrestleMania, which was disappointing. I was hanging on to that moment of give Hogan a final send-off, and if he could have it at that WrestleMania and it's with Vince involved, and maybe Hogan shaves Vince's hair and then he walks away, that would have been, I'd have been cool with that. But Hulk couldn't get out of his own way, allegedly. So he eventually would go to TNA, and I did not care for the TNA run. The only thing I enjoyed about Hulk Hogan's involvement in TNA was the Aces and Eights storyline where he was being targeted by that motorcycle group. And I'm a big Sons of Anarchy fan. I loved that show when it came out. So when they adopted that motorcycle culture into their storylines, I was on board with it. That was probably some of the best stuff TNA had ever done. It was clear. It was concise. They had continuity in their story. There was compelling storytelling. And then the big payoff at the end when Bully Ray was revealed as the leader of the Aces and Eights, and he had fooled Hulk Hogan, and he had fooled Hulk Hogan's daughter, Brooke, that he was dating at the time, which eventually I heard that they had been dating in real life. I thought that was the most enjoyable aspect of Hogan's time in TNA. I did not care for when he came in and he was the boss, and they tried to recreate some stuff. He brought his friends in, the Nasty Boys, and the Immortal was like an NWO ripoff. They tried to do the heel turn in Daytona Beach at Bound for Glory with Jeff Hardy. I did not like any of that at all. But the most enjoyable aspect of his TNA run was when he was, he was still like the figurehead boss of the show, but he was being targeted by the Aces and Eights. And I thought that was some really good stuff, which eventually led to the match with Sting at Bound for Glory, which would be his, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that was his last televised match he had. I think he eventually wrestled a tag match on a European tour for TNA, and that was the end of it for him. But even the match with Sting, I knew what I was getting, and it wasn't going to be very good. The only thing that was good about that was the end when he hulked up and he, pretty much fought off all the heels that were working for him, that turned on him. And him and Sting, hugged and reunited. Even the stuff with Joker Sting wasn't bad. I'll give him that. Where Joker Sting was kind of stalking Hogan, and Joker Sting was trying to, get TNA back to where it used to be before Hogan and Bischoff kind of had their hooks in it, and poisoned it, if you will. But yeah, that was the only enjoyable stuff that I should say, that was the only stuff I enjoyed from his TNA run, was a little bit of that Joker Sting, but more importantly, the Aces and Eights. And then eventually I thought to myself, all right, he needs to come back and do something at WrestleMania at some point, whether they induct the NWO into the Hall of Fame or what have you. And so 2014, he was the host in New Orleans. I was super jazzed up. That's the last WrestleMania I attended. And to see him as the host, I never thought I'd see Hulk Hogan in person again, but that was so much fun. The coolest moment I've ever been a part of up until more recently, meeting him, and I'll get to that in a minute, was being in attendance for the opening segment at WrestleMania 30 with Hulk Hogan, Stone Cold Steve Austin, and The Rock, and they pretty much, I looked at it as they were toasting the legacy and the lineage of WrestleMania, and they were passing the torch to the newer era of wrestlers in WWE. And that was just such a cool moment. He came out, he screwed up and called the Superdome the Silver Dome. That got a laugh out of everybody. And then eventually he had the face-to-face with Austin, and they kind of, I guess you could say, on screen buried the hatchet. And then The Rock came out, and they all like, that was the coolest shit that I had ever been a part of. To be there in person. I'd been to a lot of wrestling events, but that's my favorite in-person WrestleMania moment that I was there for. It was just so cool and so fun, and we got a little taste of Hulk Hogan sharing the WrestleMania stage, if you will, with Stone Cold Steve Austin, the match that I wanted to see and millions of others wanted to see as well. And then Hogan's relationship would continue with WWE at that time. There was the launch of the network, so he had to be a big part of that with all the documentaries and the stuff he was involved in with the network that eventually led to one of the coolest WrestleMania moments that I wasn't a part of, that I was jealous of, was the following year when the NWO came out during the Sting Triple H match, which I had zero expectations for. And it was such a spectacle when that music hit and they all came out. I remember, and I've said this before, I remember my wife, Nikki, she was in bed sleeping, and I shot up out of bed, and it scared her. She was like, "What's the matter? Is everything all right?" And I just said, "No, the goddamn NWO's at WrestleMania." And it was Hogan, Hall, and Nash, and they did the thing with DX, and they had the standoff at the end, and I was so jealous. I remember Justin telling me, Justin and Daryl both telling me that some of the NXT guys were on the floor watching the show, and they were close to the section where my brother was sitting, and they were so excited to see the NWO that I think what's his name? He just recently got released from WWE a while back. He's dating he's married to the former female star Emma, Tennille Dashwood, Madcap Moss, whatever the fuck is, Riddick Moss, right? He two-sweeted my brothers, and they it was such a cool moment. The pop for that was amazing, and then just to see all three of them come out decked in the NWO gear, that was when I knew. I was like, all right, they kind of treated the NWO, the WWE and their lineage kind of treated the NWO with a little bit of respect to put them in a position like that on the show, which was kind of cool. So at that point, I knew that all right, they're going to do an NWO induction for sure into the Hall of Fame. They'll milk that, and they did. In 2021, unfortunately, it took place during COVID, and they were part of that weird, Thunderdome Hall of Fame, which was it was awful. It was not a good idea. They shouldn't have even done it. It was so fucking dumb. But to see the NWO get its induction into the Hall of Fame, that was cool. With Hogan, Hall, Nash, and Six, X-Pac. Now, prior to that, Hulk Hogan had been gone from WWE for a few years because of the racial remarks that were made in the sex tape that leaked by Gawker. And as much as I love Hulk Hogan, I think he was 100% wrong for doing that. I was very disappointed in him, and I know that people say some crazy things and wild things in moments of trauma. I believe at that time, he was going through a divorce. His daughter was running wild, brother, as they would say. His son had just gotten to that car accident. I think he was in jail. So, he had said some pretty wild stuff, and I don't condone what he said. I think it was wrong, but I'm also a believer of people deserving second chances. And he's getting one now, although he does make some controversial remarks, especially more recently regarding the presidential nominee, Kamala Harris, which I'm not going to get into politics, but I choose to see Hulk Hogan as the character on television. As the human being, I don't know the man, and how he portrays himself, whether it's his political beliefs, or I could give a shit about that. The man made my childhood so much fun. I don't condone what he has said. I don't condone the use of the N-word, and I don't condone any of that stuff. I think it's wrong, and he should be held accountable for it. But what he did for my childhood made my childhood so much fun, and I wouldn't be the wrestling fan that I am today. And that's how I choose to see Hulk Hogan. But I understand why other people choose to see him differently. I think some people take the Hulk Hogan character and they like muddy it with what he has done more recently with the N-word leaking in the sex tape and his comments about Kamala Harris and endorsing Donald Trump. I think people kind of muddy all that. And I keep that shit separate, okay? I keep that separate. Now, if it comes to find out that Hulk Hogan, used to traffic women and young kids, then, I'll probably write him off forever. But there's nothing more than I could say other than he greatly impacted my childhood as a wrestling fan and made it so much fun to growing up that, I get nostalgic thinking about why I'm a wrestling fan. And that's why I do this podcast, because of the memories I had growing up as a fan of his and his character and all the other, characters that impacted me from a wrestling standpoint. Now, let's get to the main event, okay? Meeting him at Fanatics Fest in New York City. For years, I've always had him on my bucket list, him and Randy Savage. Unfortunately, Randy Savage is no longer with us. He had passed away in 2011. I have an autographed picture of Randy Savage hanging on my wall that I got at Ken's Cards in Berlin, Connecticut. Certificate of authenticity is on there. So that's the closest thing I'll ever get to meeting Randy Savage. But he's on, Hulk Hogan was on my bucket list, and I thought to myself, he's in his 70s. He doesn't do a lot of these. I know that he's got the surf shops down in Florida and his restaurant, and he does a lot of these meet and greets there. I wasn't going to fly down to Florida on a weekend. He was going to be doing one of those things just to meet him. If I happened to be in Florida on vacation and they were doing one, then I would have made more of an effort. But once I heard that he was going to be a part of the Fanatics Fest, I said to myself, whatever it is, I'm going to spend it to meet him, because he doesn't do many of these, and he's 71 years old, and I think it's about time. So I spent the money, and I'm not ashamed to say it was $246 to meet him, just to take a picture with him. Now, had you got anything signed, any ring memorabilia, ring used memorabilia, cards, pictures, whatever, that was all separate shit. But I thought, I already have a autographed framed photo of Hulk Hogan in my Hulk Hogan section of my basement here, my wrestling section. He's being bear hugged by Andre the Giant from WrestleMania 3. They have a big it's like a almost one of those like shadow board framed photos that my brother Daryl got me for Christmas a number of years ago. But so I thought I already got something signed by him, so let me get the opportunity to meet him. That's all I want. And I don't care how long it is, but as long as I got to say I meet him, take a picture with him, and that I could die as a wrestling fan. So it was $200 to just take a picture with him. After all the fees, I got a digital copy emailed to me, an 8x10 that they print out there. I paid for some insurance in the event that he couldn't make it, or that I couldn't make it as well. Daryl came with me. The whole Fanatics Fest itself was pretty cool. It was the first thing of its kind, like major. And you see a lot of these conventions, Comic-Cons, and sports card shows and things like that. And you get some big names, but like every big name was at like the top of the list that was at this place, between WWE, UFC, Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, NFL, WNBA. Like, they had everybody there. Tom Brady had a stage show with Stephen A. Smith. You had to pay tickets for. That was the only appearance he was doing. He wasn't taking pictures and signing. Jeter did a panel with David Ortiz from the Red Sox. Derek Jeter and David Ortiz talking about the classic Yankees-Red Sox rivalry in baseball. Wrestlers did some panels. I know CM Punk, Paul Heyman did a panel. They had all kinds of exhibits there, a UFC octagon where you can take pictures in the octagon. I believe Holly Holm was there. NFL had a setup. You could take a picture with the Lombardi Trophy, look at all the rings from every Super Bowl winner. Major League Baseball had some batting cages. NBA had a basketball court. There was a merchandise stand. There was a lot of card vendors there. Now, I'm not big on the cards. I know that's kind of come back in more recent years. I do the toys, the wrestling toys, but I was amazed at the people that go there and spend the type of money that they do. Like, it's unreal. Like, to either collect these or like resell them. Like, there were guys with like rolling suitcases. I was just looking at cards and just seeing what the cards were like now compared to what they were when I used to collect baseball and basketball cards when I was a kid. And there was a guy with a rolling suitcase at like the next booth over. And a lot of these card vendors, they didn't just have like cards like on the table. They had them in like cases, like glass cases. They had to like open them up and, you can like, they'll take the card out and the card's in a protective case that has like screws. You got to like take a screwdriver and like unscrew it if you want to put the physical card out. So this one guy's got this rolling suitcase and he pulls he's talking to the guy at the next table over about these certain cards. I don't even know what he grabbed. I don't know if it was baseball, basketball, whatever. I have no idea. But I look over and he pulls out this big bank bag, like a heavy-duty canvas bag with like this heavy-duty zipper, but the zipper's got a lock on it, like to put a key in. And I'm like, would this guy rob a bank? And he pulls out this wad. I swear to you, I'm not exaggerating. He must have spent like over $50,000 on cards. So I'm guessing like he either resells them or he's some fucking stupid rich gazillionaire that's got money to play with on things like this. And I'm not saying I robbed Peter to pay Paul to meet Hulk Hogan, but goddamn, like when I saw this, and I was surprised like how confident he like pulled this money out and handed it to the guy, and the guy had to count it and all this other shit. And I was amazed that that there wasn't a crowd around this guy because he had so much money. So we walked around, and WWE had an exhibit too. They had like ring used gear from like Bret Hart and Undertaker and Hulk Hogan, and then they had like you could do your own entrance. So Daryl and I were thinking about doing an entrance. We were going to do the NWO. So we saw a lot of kids do the Jey Uso entrance with the Yeet, and we saw a lot of Rhea Ripley entrances, and then eventually I was following fanatics on social media, and apparently when we were waiting in line to meet Hogan, Triple H came out during the entrance and waved to all the people, and then right before we left, LA Knight had showed up because he was making an appearance there as well. But yeah, let's get down to it. Meeting Hogan. We waited in line for maybe about 40 minutes, and we were part of the first group to meet him. Now, Fanatics, it's a new thing, so I imagine there was some kinks they need to work out, but there was a little bit of disorganization because when I bought the tickets for Daryl and myself, I bought them like literally at like 12:01 noontime the day they went on sale. So I was a part of the first group, but there was a couple of groups before us that went for like Americans with Disabilities Act, kids in strollers, medical exemptions, and then like people who had VIP access that got to meet him before us. So we were group one. They put us in a line, and they're like, all right, group one, you're in this line. So group one's in the line, and the guy goes over, and he's like, all right, you're group one, you're line 7, now you got to go to line 10. And so then they filled up our line with groups 2 and 3. And then they started letting them go through. And the guy in front of me that was in our line, he was there with his daughter, and she was there to meet like Liv Morgan, and so he brought her to meet Hulk Hogan. And he looks at me, he was like, you see this? And I said, yeah. I go, we were before them, we're group one. So we walked over to the guy and we're like, hey, why did you move our line and let those other guys go before us? Like, we're group one. And the guy was like, you're going to meet him, don't worry. And I was like, that's not the point. The point is that we bought these tickets at this time. We're entitled to meet him first. That's just the way it is. And I showed him my ticket, and he looked at me and he goes, oh, shit. And so he screwed up. He made a mistake, and he apologized for it. And he eventually went to somebody else that worked there, and they sorted it out. So we got to meet him. Now, they were very strict about phones. So when we got to the line, the guy who I just spoke with that screwed up said, listen, because I bought the tickets for Daryl and myself, and Daryl was going to get a separate picture, and I was going to get a separate picture. You guys saw it out there on Facebook. I posted it. And Daryl and myself, like I said, had separate pictures. So the guy said to us, when you go in there, just show them your ticket, and so that they don't try to put you two together. So I bring the phone in, and they have all the pictures that are taking place. They have them cordoned off in like a pipe and drape curtain area, so that like people don't walk by and try and get like free selfies with Hulk, right? And the guy that was taking the picture looked at me and was like, "Hey, bro, put your phone away. There's no phones allowed." And he was like being like a fucking dick about it. So I was like, "Hey, bro, showing him my ticket so I can make sure that they don't bundle me and him together. Thanks, bro. If you know me, I'll give it back to you. If you're an asshole, I'm going to match it and exceed the assholeness." So I tell the guy, "Hey, by the way, I got a separate ticket for him and for me. We're going to take pictures separately. We're not together." He's like, "Yeah, no problem. Don't worry about it." So I go first, and Hulk sees me, and I'm wearing the shirt that you see in the picture with him. This is American made, and I got it on 80stees.com, and the reason why I got it was because it was the first shirt. First of all, it's a shirt that you can wear anywhere, okay? It's not something that, it's not just a wrestling shirt. Like, you can actually wear it anywhere. But I also got it because of the nostalgic look to it, and it was the first shirt he wore when he wrestled the Iron Sheik and won the WWF Championship in Madison Square Garden in New York City. And I thought, well, we're going to be in New York City. I'm meeting Hulk Hogan. Why not? So it just fit. It worked. So Hulk sees me. He's like, "Get over here, American-made brother," and shakes my hand. And I just looked at him, and like I said, maybe 2.5 minutes. It was short. And I just said, "Hey, man, I just want you to know how much I appreciate you doing these at this stage in your life. You don't do many of these, so I had to come out and meet you. And I appreciate you making my childhood so much fun. Thank you so much for making it so much fun to be a wrestling fan growing up watching you." And he looked at me, and I felt it was genuine. He goes, "You know what, man? Thank you so much, brother. I really appreciate you saying that. Thank you for coming out today." And as I'm talking to him, the camera guy who was being a dick about my phone was like, "All right, man, we got to take this picture. Let's move this along." And Hulk stops him and was like, "Don't worry, brother. Let him finish. He's got a minute or so." He's like, He's good, brother. Let him finish." And I thought that was kind of cool. It was like, he was letting me have my moment with him. And obviously I wish I had more time with him, but he gave me the opportunity to share how I felt about him. And he, like I said, he looked at me very sincerely and was like, "Thank you so much. I really appreciate you saying those kind words to me." I didn't want to talk about when you slammed Andre the Giant, or when you became a bad guy, or when you wrestled Mr. Wonderful in the cage. I didn't want to talk about any of that stuff. I just wanted him to know how I felt and what his impact he had on me as a kid growing up, and then throughout the course of my wrestling fandom. So I got to say that to him, and he looked and felt genuine. And it made my day at the end of the day. And then, he shook my hand. He's like, "All right, brother, let's take this picture, dude." And, I put the fist up, and he puts his fist up, and, we shake hands again after we take the picture. And it was like, he's like, "Thank you again so much. Thank you for coming out. God bless you, brother. I hope you have a great day." And I was like, "Thanks, man. I really appreciate that. God bless you too." And I walked out, and I was like, "Oh my God. I just met Hulk Hogan. I met my hero as a kid. This is unbelievable." And I just did, and that was the title of my picture in my social, on our social media page, and there's my story. I just did some bucket list shit, brother. I did. That was my bucket list, and I can die now as a happy wrestling fan that I got to meet Hulk Hogan. At 71 years old. Now, regardless of what you think of him now, because of his politics and the things that he said, I had fun. I enjoyed myself. That's all that really matters. Okay. at the end of the day. It was well worth the money spent. Now, come to find out, excuse me, let me take a sip of my coffee. Come to find out, my supervisor at work, huge wrestling fan. So we've chalked it up a little bit talking wrestling. Mike Moran, what's up, buddy? Hope you're doing well, brother. And Mike, so we talked about it, and he's met Hulk, I think, once or twice, but Hulk was actually in the area in Rhode Island, next state over, earlier this week, promoting his beer. So Mike went with his girlfriend to some liquor store and got to meet Hulk for free. And I was like, son of a bitch. I just dropped over $3, including the ticket to get into the venue, over $3 to meet my hero, and you stand in line for an hour and you get to meet Hulk. And so he was telling me that it was a little different than Fanatics. They weren't rushing people through, and he maybe got about 5 minutes or so with Hulk, and he took some pictures and put it up on his story, and then he went to some bar later where Hulk was promoting this Real American beer, and he got to go there. He knew he wasn't going to meet him there because there was a huge crowd, so he told me that his girlfriend suggested they go to the liquor store, and they did, and they was happy for Mike because I love talking wrestling, chalking it up with him. Good dude overall. Glad he's one of my supervisors at work. But anyways, Mike, hope you're doing well, and keep doing what you do, man. I appreciate you. So yeah, that does it. This is the end of Diary of a Hulkamaniac Part 2. I thank you all for press and play, hit and download. I'm going to be back to more of a regular schedule, if you will, throughout the remainder of the year. Summertime's a little difficult because I'm busier in the summertime. I work a little more, and I'm a beach bum. I like to be outside, flip-flop, shorts, and a t-shirt, and taking in the nice weather. So yeah, that's why I was kind of absent, if you will, this last month or so. But we're getting ready for Bash in Berlin later today on Peacock. Cody Rhodes, Kevin Owens for the championship. Gunther and Randy Orton. CM Punk and Drew McIntyre in a strap match. We had All In last weekend from Wembley. I actually watched that. That was a pretty fun show. Not a big AEW guy, but they definitely, very impressive that 53,000 people filled that stadium, and they got a pretty badass pay-per-view. Regardless of what you think of AEW and their product lately, that was a lot of fun. So yeah, looking forward to Bash in Berlin. Looking forward to getting more shows out to you guys and listening. And thank you so much for the support. No matter how many of you or how little of you listen, it's really cool that whoever you are and how many of you are, take the time to listen to me and hear me chop it up and talk about my wrestling fandom. That means a lot to me. Whether it's 20 of you or 20,000 of you. I've never hit 20,000 downloads for a single episode, I'll tell you that right now. But yeah, it's humbling and it's pretty cool. So yeah, go ahead and hit that like button. Rate and review us over on Podbean by searching Retromania with a W. You can also hit us up on our social media, facebook.com/kickingout@2, as well as our Twitter handle @kickingout2, KICKNOUT, and the number 2. Been kind of inactive on social media, but I'll get back to that at some point too as well. So if you got any fun wrestling memories or Hulk Hogan memories to share, put it up on our social media, and love to hear from you. So yeah, that about does it for this episode of Kicking Out at 2. Hit you with the big boot, drop the big leg, and put you down for the 1, 2, 3, and we will see you all next time, brother.